Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Inanzalnahu fi laylatul qadr. Wa ma adraka ma laylatul qadr. Laylatul qadri khayrun min alf shahr. Tananzalu malaikatu wa ruhu fiha bi-izni rabbihim min kulli amr. Salam. Hiya hatta matlai al-fajr. Sadaqallahu azim. Welcome. I'm very pleased to be here, have this opportunity. Thank the brothers and sisters for putting it together. Today is the 7th of February, 2021. I'm in Seattle, Washington. Weather today is lovely. Today is one of my sister's birthdays. I have 4 sisters and a brother. And my sister Janice is just younger than me. I'm the second child and she's the third of 6. And her birthday is today. And I'm saying this, one, just to introduce myself in the context of my family, but also I have to try to remember to tell her happy birthday today. Her children, she has 3 children, and they gave her a birthday gift of sending her to a hotel near the ocean for 3 days so she can just relax away from work and grandchildren and house, mortgages and all that stuff. So I grew up in a military family when I was a child. My father was an officer in the United States Army, and we lived different places around the world. When I was a small child, we lived in Germany, and we traveled all over the United States. I lived in the South, the Northeast, the West Coast, the Southeast. So I got a good sense of what the US had to offer from my perspective as a young person growing up in a family that usually changed our homes every 2.5 to 3 years. And that continued right until I was a junior in high school. Skipping ahead to high school, which were really formative years in my life. I started high school in Virginia. I was an athlete in middle school, junior high school, and I continued with athletics when I was in high school. I played 3 sports, football, basketball, and baseball. And I was looking at the time when I was a freshman in high school of playing sports at some university and then going on to play professional sports in one of those arenas, probably baseball, possibly basketball, maybe football. Things changed when I was in San Francisco. San Francisco has always been one of the more progressive cities in the United States, in the sense that people there tend to be well educated, and there has always been a lot of social movement for social justice in San Francisco. I was there in the late 60s, and if you know a little bit about the 60s in the United States, this was the era of movement. For the most part, I was not paying attention to it. When I transferred from Virginia to San Francisco as a junior in high school, I immediately started playing 3 sports at my high school, George Washington High School in San Francisco. And that was my focus. In order to allow me to play sports, my parents insisted that my grades were always at least a B average. And so I always had minimally a B average, but I only had a B average because I wanted to play sports. I wasn't so much interested in learning. I was more interested in sports, and socializing mainly with athletes around campus. Um, and then things started to change. I started to be impacted by the various movements that were occurring in the late 60s in San Francisco. First and foremost, that was still the hippie movement was going on in San Francisco. Free love, consciousness, um, turning on to drugs, tuning in to, um, to yourself, turning off the TV. In fact, I had a lab partner in my chemistry class named Maureen. And one day I had had a really good game in basketball the day before. And so they started announcing my statistics over the loudspeaker while everybody was in their homeroom before they went to class in the morning. And it was one of my best days ever in basketball. So when I arrived in my chemistry class, Maureen said to me, um, she said, I heard them talking about Ernie Johnson and the points that he scored. Was that you? I said, yeah, that's me. And she said, so you're a jock? Like placing being an athlete in a pejorative type of light. I'd never heard that before. And I realized that she didn't have very much admiration for athletes. And so I asked her, I said, yeah, I am. I said, what do you think of jocks? She said, well, I just never thought of you as, you know, a jock. So, you know, just your focus is just on playing ball. And I started from that moment to start to really problematize being an athlete. I also had excellent teachers in high school. One was Mr. Wilson. He was African-American English teacher, and he tapped us into the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement. We read literature related to it, and I started to think about it. And then I started to pay attention to people around me in my environment. And in my environment, you had women who were impacted by the feminist movement. You had the anti-war movement. You had the civil rights movement. You had the Black Power movement. You had an environmental movement. This is all in San Francisco in the late 60s and more. What else? But the anti-war, the Black Power movement, the feminist movement, and the civil rights movement started now to seep into my consciousness. And so by the time I reached the spring, the final semester of my senior year, I had decided not to play sports in the university. And I decided that I was going to go to the university and cultivate my mind and get involved in issues around social justice. That was not a popular decision with a lot of people, but my father supported me in it. And he was happy to see me using my brain. And of course, my sisters supported me, and my mother supported me. So I didn't need any other support. So I went to my father's alma mater. He graduated from Hampton University in Virginia, which is a historically Black college. My sister went there before me. It's my older sister, Muriel. She's just almost 2 years older than me, and she's 2 years ahead of me. So she was at Hampton before me, and I followed there when I left high school. This was the 1972. I graduated high school in 71. At Hampton, I ran into culture shock. At one level, it was the best time of my life because it was the first time I had been around so many intellectual African Americans. And so it was the first time that I realized all my teachers had high expectations for me. when I was coming up in school, I was surprised at some of the low expectations that teachers had for African Americans. And so I noticed that. And then, of course, the social life was great at Hampton. The education was great, the social life was great, and everything was going fine. But politically, I became frustrated with the school. I won't tell the entire story, but what happened was, well, we ran into discrimination. Some of my classmates and I, one weekend, were discriminated against. And they were going to arrest one of my classmates. And so we all volunteered to be arrested. And we were falsely charged with things we didn't do. We went to court. We were charged in court with things that we didn't do. And the college did not support us vocally. And at the time, my father was in Vietnam. That was his second tour in Vietnam. And so everybody in my household was a little tense. My mother was all stressed out already, and then she had that to deal with. And so I was embarrassed by that. But then I was very disappointed in the school being so conservative and not taking our side when we were clearly discriminated against. So I left Hampton. I was called in and lectured by one of the administrators who actually knew my father, went to school with my father. And I didn't appreciate it. So I left his office and went to the registrar's office and started the process of transferring. I didn't even know where I was going, but I was out. And I was a little bit of a hothead, so I left. And the best choice for me was to join my dad when he came back from Vietnam and was stationed in Hawaii. That's how I ended up in Hawaii. So I transferred as a freshman at university to the University of Hawaii. Some of you will appreciate this. Resident tuition at the University of Hawaii in 1973 was $119 a semester. You hear what I said? $240 a year for your state-sponsored university education. And so that just shows you how far this country has strayed from its obligation to providing social opportunity and upliftment for the American people. So at the University of Hawaii, I, of course, wasn't playing sports. I was focusing on my education. I got a BA in psychology, and I started to be interested in studying world religions. And I studied, I signed up for a religion course, but it was overloaded. And so they gave us an option of studying yoga at a theoretical, philosophical level, and also practicing yoga as a substitute for this world religion course. And so I was happy to do that because I was athletic and I knew yoga involved the body and movement and exercise. And so I got involved in yoga. That led me into meditation. That led me into Eastern martial arts, and particularly things like Tai Chi. I was very fascinated with Tai Chi. I practiced Tai Chi, and I started studying Hinduism. I got a little interested in Buddhism, comparing it to Hinduism. And I was pursuing, I would say, my spirit quest. I was looking for my direction, the direction that I set when I stopped the path of becoming a professional athlete. That was all about what was happening in San Francisco when I was in school, where people were saying things like, kill the TV. That was one of the movements in the 70s in San Francisco that Maureen's parents were into, I believe. And the notion was, don't allow yourself to be caught up in a false reality. And At that time period, it was the TV. For a lot of young people now, it's social media. And they said, kill the TV and tune into yourself, right? Tune into yourself, not someone else creating a false reality and entertaining you, but tune into yourself. And I started looking at sports in that way as well. I was looking at sports as a form of entertainment. And I looked at myself as somebody who was out entertaining people in this society when people in this society didn't respect my humanity. And so I decided I wasn't a clown. Not that all athletes are clown. I'm not saying that. But for me, it was just too much to ignore the fact that in order to play sports, you had to deal with racism on a daily basis. I mean, people talk to you any kind of way. And they had many assumptions that all you could do was dribble a ball or hit a ball or catch a pass. And so while I'm in Hawaii and I'm still trying to find my direction, a Muslim appeared in Hawaii out of the blue. And when I say out of the blue, I'll just tell you the general point is that his name was Sheikh Muhammad. He had been a Black Muslim in Queens, New York. He met Sudanese in the consulate in New York back in the 1970s. Early 70s, he became a Muslim, an Orthodox Muslim. He learned Arabic. He tried to introduce the Quran to the Nation of Islam in Queens, I believe. He lived in Queens. I believe his temple was in Queens. They kicked him out of the Nation of Islam when he tried to introduce the Quran. So he became, I would say, influenced by the spirit of Sufism in many Sudanese Muslims. And he defined himself as a Sufi. And he just had a dream. He woke up one morning, told his wife he was going to Hawaii. She said, Hawaii? This is from New York. And he said, yeah. He said, I dreamed that I need to go to Hawaii. And she said, well, why are you going? He said, I don't know. And he got on a plane and came to Hawaii. And when he landed, some of the guys that I practiced martial arts with saw him walking around, and he was wearing a jalabia. He had a red beard with henna in it. He carried a leather bag over his shoulder, so he looked like nobody else in the entire islands of Hawaii, and he was dark chocolate brown. And so some of the brothers I knew invited him over for dinner. And I like to tell that story, but essentially there were 6 of us, 6 or 7. All of us became Muslims except for one. That night that we met him, all of us became Muslims that night when we met Sheikh Muhammad. And as far as I know, 4 of us are still Muslims. Sheikh Muhammad then did something really important with me. He said, Abdullah, he gave me my name, Abdullah. He just named me Abdullah, and I've been Abdullah ever since. He said, I would like you to come with me to Sudan, the land of the black man. He said, Sudan, not Saudi, Sudan. He said, the brothers and sisters in Sudan practice Islam. They don't preach it, they practice it, they live it. Oh, if you could come with me to Sudan. Oh, if we could travel to Sudan together. This is what he put in my mind. He is the one that introduced me to, excuse me, Salman El-Awad, who was a graduate student at the time at the University of Hawaii in agriculture. Salman is a Sudani from Gadaref, and he was the imam of the mosque at the University of Hawaii at the time. Salman became my mentor. He taught me how to pray. He taught me how to fast. And when I asked him about the possibility of traveling to Sudan, I put it in this way. I said, Salman, if I came with you to the Sudan, are there Sufis in Sudan who have a modern understanding of Islam? That's what I asked him, because my spirit quest was looking for truth. I was motivated by um, a number of questions, but the main question, the main, let me say, assumption that I had was that somewhere on this earth existed a clear understanding of Deen that made rational sense. Because what I was experiencing was that when I ask questions, you get to a certain level of questioning and people just say, oh, well, that's just a matter of faith. You just need to believe, brother. You just need to practice. And I was not always satisfied with that. So I asked Salman, is there anybody in Sudan with this modern understanding of Islam? And he told me there's one man. That's how he put it. He said, there's one man. I've read all his books. I believe everything that he says, that you could meet. I said, what's his name? He told me. At the time, it didn't mean anything, but he said, Ustaz Mahmoud, Muhammad Taha. And I said, well, Salman, if we go to Sudan, you think I can find him? Can I meet him? Because my imagination was that this Sufi lived up in the mountain in a cave, and that it was going to be, and I think I got that idea from watching the Ethiopian Christians, many of whom build their churches up in the mountains, and some of the initiates have to climb ropes up a mountainside in order to get to the churches. I think that influenced my idea. I said, that's what I'm going to have to do. I'm going to have to climb that rope when I get to the Sudan. So I started working out again. Salman said, yeah, we can meet him. I know people that live in the same city he lives in, and we can meet him. So that's how I ended up coming to Sudan. So, so I traveled with Salman and his wife to Sudan in 1977. At the time, I had been a Muslim a little less than 2 years. So I became a Muslim in 75, 77. Salman and his wife Maimuna are returning to Gadaref, and he invited me to come with him, and I immediately did so. I sold everything that I owned. I sold some things that I didn't even own. I had a car that my father had left me, and my father and I share the same name. He's passed now, but we share the same name, Ernest B. Johnson. And so the car was in the name of Ernest B. Johnson. And I sold his car, not even thinking that it wasn't my car. But he had given it to me, and I'm sure he didn't want it back. But yeah, I sold everything to get the ticket and to purchase a few things that I thought maybe I could sell when I got to the Sudan, so that I could find Ustaz Mahmoud Muhammad Taha to see if Sheikh Muhammad was right, that the Sudanese live Islam. Because that's what I was looking for, a modern understanding of Islam. Why? Because I have 4 sisters and a mother, and I had seen the double standard in Islam, where women were not always treated as equitably as they should be. Many times they were treated as less than men. And that just didn't make sense to me. I knew too many powerful women in our history as African Americans in this world, if you just pay attention. And I said, there's something not right about that interpretation. So I wanted an interpretation that made sense in the 21st century. I hadn't quite articulated it, but it really kind of had to do with the equity or equality, if you like, between men and women. And so this is one of the things that I was hoping I would find in this teacher. And then I wanted to also find somebody that was practicing what they preached, that weren't saying something and doing something else. Because for me, that's always been a waste of time. And I didn't feel that I should waste time with people that are talking a good game, but not able to back it up with action. So um, that was Ramadan, 1977. And we arrive in Gadaref, and I love Gadaref. I mean, wow, what a place, what a first place. And Salman's people, live in the traditional homes, and we were sleeping out in the courtyard under the stars, and people were just traveling around, and everybody's beautiful, you know, everybody's beautiful. And so I was just amazed with Gadaref. I might not have ever left Gadaref if I didn't need to meet Ustaz Mahmoud. I liked it that much. But then, uh, end of Ramadan or Eid, we then traveled to Umdurman. We met Salman's friend Merani. Merani knew exactly where Ustaz Mahmoud lived, as Salman said he would. And within, I'd say, the first 3 weeks I arrived in Sudan, I was there meeting Ustaz Mahmoud. And I've told the story a lot. Some of you might not have heard it, but when when we arrived, it was Hamla, during the time of Hamla. So Ustaz was alone. There were not many people around. The brothers and sisters were out in the towns, Umdurman, Khartoum North, Khartoum, um, having the rukun, the plebiscites, the corner discussions with people about ideas that were important to people in the street, and people gathered around in these conversations. So Stas was alone. So I came in. Um, Meroni introduced me. Um, I was sent to the saloon, and then Ustaz came into the saloon, and there were some brothers and sisters also present. And immediately I was impressed with him just when he walked in the room. Just his look, um, his energy. It was startling, actually. And the respect that people had before he came into the room. I watched grown men sitting madankara, with their hands around their knees on the floor, right? Like the teacher was about to come into the room when you're a small child. Grown men sitting like that. And I was, wow, who is he? And he came in, and then I realized who he was. I said, he's somebody. This man is somebody. So that was the first impression. And then, he had some business, I think, things he spoke to some of the people in the room. I don't know about what. It was in Arabic. And then he turned to me and he said, Abdullah, I understand that you're from America. Yes, he said. And that you're a Christian. I said, yes. He said, what would cause a person raised as a Christian to travel from the United States to Sudan searching for Islam? And I was, whoa, that's pretty direct. That's like, you just summed up my entire consciousness in one sentence, my whole reason for being there. He just put it into those two questions. And so I answered him, and I told him that I was searching and I hadn't found answers. And I had found people who weren't convincing. And I found people who professed to believe in different doctrines, but they didn't follow them in their personal life. And he said, that's good. And he then sent the brothers to get some pamphlets for me that were written in English. Second Message of Islam, and I believe the Return of Christ, maybe towards the Second Message of Islam. I don't remember the three, but there were three pamphlets in English. And I read them. I went back to Merani's house. I read the pamphlets, and within 2 days, it might have been the next day, but I think it was 2 days later, I returned to Stas's house and I brought my suitcase with me. But I didn't want, oh, but before that, I want to tell you something that happened. When we left, it was now the Hamla buses were coming back. And so Stas now had things to do. And so we said good, thanked him for his time and said goodbye. And we were leaving. And as we left his house, the Hamla buses were coming down the road. And I heard them. I heard the bus, and then I heard some music, and it sounded very lovely. I didn't know what it was, but it was lovely. It was coming. Each of the buses, there was some type of chanting going on. And as it got closer and closer, I heard Allah. And so I said to, and then I looked up, and I guess it was the side. It seemed like everybody was wearing white. So I must have seen the sisters when I looked up at the bus. And it was this white light. And so I said to Salman, I said, Salman, are these his students? And he said, yeah, those are his students. I said, I'm coming back. I'm coming back here. I don't need to read the books. I didn't say that, but in my mind, that's what I was thinking. I'm coming back to study with him if these are his students. I just thought I got that impression just from seeing the bus return with people on it chanting Allah, dressed in white with light coming out the bus. So I brought my suitcase, and I didn't want to be presumptuous, so I didn't bring it inside the compound of the staff. I left it outside by the tree. The brothers were telling me, no, take it down. I don't know if I'm invited yet, so I don't want to just come with my suitcase like, So I left it by the tree, and then it was another day where there was Hamla. I had time with Ustaz again. He said, what did you think of the books? And I had read them all. I think the second message I had maybe read twice. It was a short pamphlet. And I said, I think that you're the truth that I'm looking for. That's what I said. And he said, oh, no. No, he didn't say, well, no. He said, oh, but you can't know that for sure. He said, the only way that you can know that we are true to our word is if you live with us and watch our practice. Are we practicing what we have claimed? And I said, wow. I said, well, I'm ready to live with you. My bags are out by the tree. He said, fine. And then he organized with the brothers, and they took me to Beit al-Aqwan Aleph, and the rest is, I never intended to stay. Some of you don't know this, but I stayed from 1977 to 1986. I returned home once for the summer because my mother missed me. And my father said, come home. But I intended to come home. I was thinking, I'm going to go to Sudan, and I want to meet Ustaz Mahmoud. And then from Sudan, I'm going to go to Saudi Arabia. I just had that in my mind because a lot of people were traveling to Saudi Arabia. They were studying Arabic. They were coming back. They were building mosques and that type of thing. And so I said, maybe that's my path. I don't know. But that was in my mind. Till this day, I haven't been to Saudi Arabia. And when I do go, I'm going to want to go visit the Prophet's tomb. That's what my intention is, if I'm blessed to be able to do that. So I stayed that 8 years because the Ustaz Mahmoud, after I was there, I came in 77. By 82, it was apparent that the government was suppressing us. They had been suppressing us all along, even though Ustaz was not as critical of the Numeri government as many intellectuals were. He was saying that they're better than what's going to replace them if that government disappears. But I felt the pressure when I came back in 1980 that things had changed. And then by 1982, then there was real repression. And of course, in 1983, they arrest Ustaz Mahmoud and 50 other brothers and sisters. And so, you know, from my standpoint, that's not a time to leave. So I stayed. And I tell people those were the best years of my life, really, right? And the reason for that is because I found what I was looking for, right? I found an understanding of monotheism that is rational, comprehensive, and feels a lot like me to be the truth with a capital T. And so from there, I'm here. While I was at, you know, at university, while I was there, brothers helped me get a job at University of Khartoum. Dr. Abdullah Ahmed Naim told me there was an opening to teach English at the university. I never intended to teach at the university. I was happy teaching high school English because people, you know, Salman had told me I can, with my bachelor's, I could do that, make a living. That was sufficient. But Abdullah, you know, encouraged me to go apply for the position at University of Khartoum, and I did, and I'm really happy that I did because I've been teaching at universities ever since, or colleges, and I was able to get my master's degree at University of Khartoum while I was there, which was a blessing. I studied Sudanese and African languages. I was particularly interested in language classification and looking at colonial methods of classification and comparing them to a more modern system of classifying languages. And in that, I got to learn some of the history of colonialism in the Sudan. I also was introduced to Nubian history. I have a background in teaching African American history, and I've always focused on Africa. And now I started not just looking at Swahili culture in East Africa, but Nubian culture as well. And when I returned to the States in '86, I got my doctorate at the University of Washington. I applied to a bunch of schools, but my first choice was this school because my parents lived in Seattle. And I've basically been here ever since, either teaching at the University of Washington or where I am now at Shoreline, and I'm adjunct at the University of Washington. So I really wanted to pause for the cause right now and allow people to ask some questions. And then if there's more that I need to say, maybe it can be based on the questions that are asked. Okay. If you have a question at any time, then just ask, but I just want to make sure that if questions arise, but I'm going to, Salwa.
There is one. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. Okay. Salwa.
I'm sorry, what is a hamla?
That's a book distribution. So one of the practices that Ustaz Mahmoud instituted amongst the people in the New Islamic Mission, also called the Jamhurin, was that they created their own pamphlets and books. Ustaz believed that if you depended upon advertisement for your materials, then you could not be free to say what you wanted. And he believed in free thought to the point that he was consistent in all manners regarding free thought. So that's where it starts. So we produced our own pamphlets and books. In the house I lived in, Beit al-Ikhwan Aleph, we had a printing press, and brothers were up into the night producing pamphlets every week. We would take those pamphlets after zikr. There were in Khartoum. Now this is happening in multiple cities, but in Umdurman, where I was living, there were 4 houses plus 1, Beit al-Ustaz. The sisters lived in Beit al-Ustaz. The brothers were in Beit al-Ikhwan, Aleph, Ba, Jim, and Dal, all walking distance to Beit al-Ustaz in Umdurman, Sawra, Haraula. And then we would walk to Ustaz's house, maybe 45 minutes before sunset. We would chant. When the sun set, we would pray Maghrib. And at the time we were praying Maghrib, the buses would arrive. The Hamla buses, the ones I talked about earlier. Whatever was the current publication, brothers and sisters would take it. And then the buses would take them to the 3 cities, Umdurman, Khartoum North, and Khartoum, to the market, the souk. And then they would establish a discussion corner. That's what a rukun is. It's a corner, a discussion corner in the evening, right, after Maghrib, in the cities, with our sisters leading many of the discussions. Something revolutionary in the Islamic world, not just in Sudan. And those discussions started, what happened was, in the beginning, we had tremendous resistance. By the time I arrived there in 1977, there was still resistance. But you could see by 1980, many more people were interested in what we had to say, both in the discussion corners in the evening, but we also had discussions that went on all of the college and university campus. So University of Khartoum, for instance, Ahmed Dali, Ustaz Ahmed Dali would hold a discussion, and Omar Garai would hold a discussion on campus. And the same thing was happening in Medani and happening in Port Sudan and happening in other places around Sudan. And so this was a very lively aspect of what we did. And I'll just tie this, Selwa, to another point. When we finished the discussions, so the discussion would usually go on, the book distribution and discussion would go on for, I'm going to say, 2 hours. And then we would come back to Beit al-Ustaz. Like, this is what happened in Umdurman, and it happened in the other cities, whoever was the head brother or sister in the other city. Come back to Beit al-Ustaz. So many people were there, we couldn't even fit in his house. We had to meet outside of his house in the area next to it. And then people would then be allowed to report back whatever interesting thing happened to them in their discussion. And so they're having a chance now to not only have a free discussion with people, with other Sudanese citizens and young people and old people and so forth in the market, but now to come back and to articulate their ideas and to articulate what they learned from it in front of Ustaz Mahmoud. Sometimes he would just listen, we go to the next person. Sometimes he would comment. Sometimes he would introduce a discussion point for people to think about. Sometimes that discussion point would be taken back to Beit al-Ikhwan. So that was our daily kind of process, and it's called the Rukun is part of the Mimbar Hur, free platform, but really it was a practice of free speech, free thinking, independent ideology, and then it's almost the Socratic method that he had us involved in, where people are refining their thinking and having deeper understandings of Fikr Jamhuriya as they hear it articulated by different brothers there, because we're all at different levels, and sometimes, you know, the discussion is going to be so beautiful and so informed and that you learn so much from listening to it. Even me with my limited Arabic, right? I loved the Rukun and the the general discussion that we would have after it, because I learned so much going out and also listening to people articulate their ideas, and Ustaz teaching us as we taught each other. Yeah. And so that was almost daily. I hope
All
that
right.
so
We have a question here in the chat, and we'll give Ahmed the chance to ask his question.
great.
Uh,
Thanks,
from
Selma,
Amal,
for her question. Just
sure.
all right. Go ahead, man.
Amal asking, thank you. She said, thank you so much for your sharing, sharing your story. I have a question. What were some of the capital T truths you felt you found?
Great question, Ahmed.
This is Amal.
Amal?
Yes.
Okay, great question, Amal. Wow. One was that Judaism, Christianity, and Islam form a trinity, that they're the same religion articulated from the same God to the same children of Adam in different times and in different places, so they take a different form. Ustaz Mahmoud is the first person I ever heard say that. He, in fact, called it an Islamic trinity. He went further than saying, he said that they're not only the same religion, that they are actually different iterations of La ilaha illallah. In a sense, they are different iterations or versions of Islam. They are Islam in the making. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and other religions, right, are leading up to the culmination of religion, which is that which was revealed in the Quran to the Holy Prophet Muhammad, when God said, on this day have I perfected my grace unto you, and I call it Islam. So that truth was something that seemed to me to make sense, because I come out of a Christian tradition, and then I studied other world religions, and I understood that there are many paths up the mountain, as the Hindus say. But some paths are better than others. Some paths will allow you to accelerate as you travel up the mountain and cover more ground more quickly, and are better equipped to solve the problems of people. This is the thing about Ustaz's ideas that seems so important for me, is that I always felt religion should apply to the individual and the society. It makes no sense to have a moral code that you practice on Saturday or Sunday or Friday. It doesn't make any sense. What good is that? Stas said the same thing. And I always thought in my mind, it's one of the problems that I discovered with people, is that they associate going in and out of prayer or in and out of a building on a particular day with deen, with religion. That's not rational. Anybody can do ritual. Anybody can go in and out of a building. What's the value of the worship? Ustaz Mahmoud talked about the fact that the value of the worship is to allow you to develop qualities in yourself that approximate the qualities of your creator. That's truth. That's with a capital T. That only makes sense. What are we here for? If it's not to return, well, how do we return? We have to refine ourselves. Well, how do we refine ourselves? We have to refine ourselves in the image of our creator. How can we return if we don't? Monkeys are not going to return unless they're pets. So that was it. And so then the other piece is that not only does Ustaz articulate this idea of the purpose of divine revelation, the fact that it is developmental, and that is Islam properly understood is the culmination of it. But he talks about the methodology of worship as established by the Holy Prophet Muhammad, and distinguishes the Holy Prophet Muhammad's behavior, his sunnah, very clearly in ways I'd never heard it spoken of. He talks about his sunnah being related to his prophethood, his relationship with Allah. Some of the things he said and he did in the 7th century had to be related to the fact he was dealing with human beings back in the 7th century. He was not a 7th century man, but he had to establish Islam amongst people in the 7th century. The 7th century was backward all over the world. The distance that we've traveled, Ustaz talks about the idea of taking legislation that was perfect for the 7th century and trying to apply it on the 21st century is like taking a outfit that you make for a 7-year-old child and forcing it on a 21-year-old child. You see? He said there's nothing wrong with the outfit. It was suitable for the 7th century. But there's something wrong with an individual that thinks that it makes sense to try to force human beings in the 21st century to follow a code that solved the problems of the 7th century. So it's that understanding of what time it is, his understanding of the needs of humanity, his understanding of how they can be addressed by revelation from the creator of humanity, perfected in his last prophet, who delivered a Quran that had 2 levels. That's simple. You read the Quran and there's, I was looking at Surah Nisa this morning. It's talking about going and killing people. What, that's not gonna, how is that gonna solve problems in the 21st century? You know? And many people think that jihad of the sword, violent jihad is prescribed for Muslims. It's not. That was a methodology that had to be employed when people were at a very low level of development. I mean, we had been worse than the 7th century, but 7th century was bad. I mean, how are you gonna, Ustaz idea, he said, you're trying to establish religion with people who bury their female children alive so as not to be shamed by somebody stealing them from them. Their solution to the problem of kidnapping daughters was to not have daughters. I'll just take other people's daughters. That's the mentality of the people you're going to come to. Now, can you come to them and say, men and women are equal? He didn't even think women had the right to life. How can you talk about equal rights to such a person? You can't. You have to give them an intermediary stage that will address their needs and develop them along the path towards humanity. And that's what the Holy Prophet Muhammad in his divine, I won't say divine, but in his grace was able to deliver. And at the same time, he was able to live by a different code. Ustaz Mahmoud clarifies that code. He clarifies Sunnah. He clarifies the Quran being 2 messages. He clarifies the unity of monotheism. He clarifies the necessity of Islam because it has a code that solves the problems of the community and the human and the individual. So truths, there are many. I couldn't even name them all. I stumbled just saying that. It's one after the other after the other. So I sum it up by saying he has an enlightened understanding that came not because he was a super intelligent man, which he was. He was an engineer at a time when very few people made it through that British system. It was designed that way. Stas made it through it and educated the British on his way through it. You know some of his stories. But my point is, he was brilliant, but his ideas don't come from just his brilliance. They come from his application of Tariq Muhammad when he was in prison and in khalwa. And he drew close to God, and he was given insights through that worship. And that's where his deep understanding of what worship is comes from. Deep understanding of the two messages of the Quran comes from. Deep understanding of the purpose for the Holy Prophet Muhammad in the first place. So, Alma, I went on, but those are some of the truths.
Great, great. I just want to mention to our audience that they can ask any question not related to the to what Dr. Ernest started with his introduction. You can ask any question related to the Republican movement or Al-Fikr al-Jamhuriyya. The chance right now for Ahmed, you can turn on your mic and ask your question.
Greetings, Ustaz Abdullah. Thank you so much for coming on today and giving us some of your background and telling us about your story. You mentioned the 1960s and 70s and some of the activism that was happening in the United States during that time. I've noticed in my studies that a lot of Black liberationists of that period had some loose affiliation with Islam, and like the Nation of Islam, some of the Black Panthers, some of the offshoots of Nation of Islam, Malcolm X, and all of that. So I was just interested to hear your take on what is it about Islam that is so attractive to Black liberation in general?
That's a beautiful question. I hope I can answer it. Thank you for the question. When I think about particularly during my lifetime, I was definitely influenced by Islam indirectly. So one of the ways I was influenced by it was to see the discipline in the Nation of Islam, where you introduce a ideology that's closer to Black nationalism, but you call it Islam. But that ideology can cause criminals in prison to clean up themselves, to discipline themselves, to come out, to establish families, and to lead dignified lives. I saw that from the Black Muslims, and they were just using the Ustaz told me one time, the only thing that Elijah Muhammad, the only manner in which Elijah Muhammad benefited Islam, no, the only thing Islamic about Elijah Muhammad was introducing the word Islam to America, something like that. But just even the Nation of Islam, right? As much as I took issue with their double standards around women, as much as I took issue with their apolitical stance on the civil rights movement, as much as I took issue with their some of their ideology, other parts of their ideology, I still recognize some of the positive aspects of them, and it was associated with that word Islam. Then you come to Malcolm. Malcolm was very instrumental in raising the consciousness of African Americans. He came out of the Nation of Islam. He was popular when he was articulating the ideas of Elijah Muhammad, but he became more popular. He became a more national figure and a more international figure when he started to articulate his own ideas, which didn't last long before he was assassinated in 65. So he just started doing that in early 64. But in that short period of time, he did. I was influenced by Malcolm because many of the brothers that I practiced martial arts with in Hawaii looked up to him. We listened to his records, and we would sit around and just marvel at his intellect and laugh at his jokes and nod at his wisdom. So he had a tremendous influence on the Black Power movement in the United States because he was a counterpoint to Dr. King. And Dr. King's notion of nonviolence, right, seemed not to be the right answer to a lot of people because Dr. King's people are being beaten, bloodied, maimed, and ultimately he's assassinated. And so many people were thinking that Malcolm's idea of fighting for your own liberation by any means necessary made more sense. So I was influenced by Malcolm. I was developing a critique of Malcolm, and I really distinguished the Malcolm that left the Nation of Islam in early '64 as the one that really was attracting me. But even some of the things he was saying before were very attractive. And then you have Muhammad Ali. Being an athlete, growing up in Black neighborhoods where everybody wanted to be able to box like Muhammad Ali. We used to slap box, so open hand boxing. That was just part of our culture. And everyone wanted to be Ali. And all the better boxers called themselves Ali. We really identified with him. And then when he took a stance on the Vietnam War and said that he's not going to Vietnam, that it's immoral, and my religious principles tell me that I don't need to go there. He said, and by the way, the Vietnamese have never called me a nigger. Why am I going to go over there and fight against them when you're my enemy here? You're mistreating my people right here, all around the country. That stance. This is the heavyweight champion of the world at the top of his game, threw it all away to stand his ground, like Malcolm stood his ground. And so Islam looms large in that way because you have these two huge figures, some of the most impactful, top 10 most impactful figures in all of African-American history, and some of them in world history, right? When you start talking about the reach of Malcolm and Martin, of course, as well, but also, who am I saying? Muhammad Ali. Yeah. So I think that contribution to theirs was really in the fact that they stood on principle and they accepted the consequences of doing so. And they sent a message to this society: we're only going to be pushed so far. And that was really something that was very attractive to people who consider themselves in the Black Power movement, but also those who were in the Civil Rights movement. They started gravitating towards Malcolm's stance, like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, when John Lewis decided not to give the speech that he had prepared at the March on Washington and gave a more toned down speech, caused him to be removed and Stokely to come in as the head of SNCC. That was all about that movement. And Stokely is really informed by Malcolm, his thinking. So I hope that answers.
All right. Okay, we have a question from Samira Malik here in the chat. She wrote, "Thanks for sharing such an amazing and inspiring story. Could you share some aspect of the second message of Islam and the specifics about how you appreciated the practical aspect while living there, or while living with, just a second, living with the Ustaz?"
Okay, sure. Wow, that's a great question. I mentioned earlier the worship of the Holy Prophet Muhammad. I think that is what kept me in Sudan and allowed me to stay in Sudan so long, is trying to follow Tariq Muhammad. So that aspect of the second message of Islam is a tremendous gift to Muslims and all of humanity. When we start to understand the notion of the purpose of worship and this idea that our worship has a purpose which has to do with our interaction with other human beings. So worship is a means to elevate your morals and to refine your moral conduct in interacting with other human beings. That just, to me, is a tremendous contribution. And Ustaz's insight into worship is like everything else. It's clear, it's simple, and it's profound. And so he says, for instance, your worship is not from Bismillah to Salamu Alaikum, it's from Salamu Alaikum to Bismillah. So it's not just you standing in front of God and doing ritual. It's what you do in terms of your interaction. It's mu'amala. What the Holy Prophet Muhammad said that. Deen is mu'amala. If you don't have mu'amala, you don't have deen. Ustaz is saying that the purpose of the worship is to refine your mu'amala. He said, in fact, they're different degrees of the same phenomenon. He talks about that. Like, worship is a form of mu'amala, refined mu'amala, and mu'amala is a form of less refined worship. But it's the same phenomenon. It's the unity that Islam brings to us in not separating ourselves from our obligation to other human beings. We're interconnected and interdependent, and we have to treat others well if we are, in fact, considering ourselves to be children of God, children of God. So that's, it starts there. And then Ustaz's articulation of the notion that the unique value, or another unique value of Islam is that it allows us to achieve the three equalities: economic equality, similar to socialism; political equality, similar to democracy; and social equality, this piece around mu'amala, treating people equally and not discriminating against people based upon their status. He said those three equalities are achievable in an Islamic context. He talks about the establishment of a constitution. But the important thing is understanding, he says, that at the end of the day, the human being is the reason that you establish this good society based on these three equalities. It's all about creating conditions for human beings to be able to accelerate their return to their creator. He talks about it as self-realization. If you go onto the website, elfikra.org, there will be the quote from Ustaz Mahmoud on self-realization. And he says that the human endeavor is not to send astronauts in an orbit in outer space. That's all fine and good, but what's the value? He said the human caravan, the purpose of the human caravan is to send each individual in their own orbit back to their creator. And all means, all aspects of society, religion, the secular state, education, the way you rear your child at home should be a means to that end, should be constructed in a way to facilitate the ability of the individual to refine themselves in the return to their creator. So these 2 points are huge. And then all the time you know, you see these really concise and insightful, yet at the same time profound, right? Statements by Ustaz Mahmoud. You have the human being, right? And he's saying all along, it's about the human being. It's about the refinement of the human being. And then you look over here and you see this refined human being saying this. So the connection between how he carried himself, how he lived his life, how his own ma'amala, his own ma'amala. Yeah, that is fikr jamhuriyah. Ustaz's ma'amala. Ustaz, you see, he's there's no division in him. He's not teaching an ideology on one side and then he's another person on the other side. He was consistent all along. I watched him for almost 9 years. He's the same human being all along. And even when he went to his death on the gallows, he did so in submission to his creator with a smile on his face. Very consistent with what he taught all along, is that you start off fearing God and then you grow closer to God and then you understand that God is not to fear. God is love. He's the personification of love. And so Ustaz Mahmoud personified that in his own interaction with people. His mu'amala was love. And it was not a syrupy kind of love. I mean, Ustaz Mahmoud was, he was a very serious human being. And you have to really examine yourself even before you approach him. But at the same time, he had tremendous love and compassion and concern for people. So yes, his ideas are fabulous, but the other fabulous aspect of Fikr Jamhuri is the man who articulated the ideas personified them in his own character. And if you try to implement some of what he taught around Tariq Muhammad, you see the benefit in yourself. So this is the other thing I'll end with is Ustaz. I explained earlier. I hope you were here, sister. I've forgotten your name now. Are you listed on here? But I hope you were here when I.
This is Samira Malik. Samira Abu Muhdan Ali.
Oh, Samira.
Yeah.
Okay. Marhaban.
Yes.
No, but I was talking about our discipline when we would go out on the book campaigns. The other thing that was introduced as our discipline was that you should attempt to pray the night vigil that the Holy Prophet Muhammad prayed any night that you can. So get up during the last third of the night and pray. So this was the fruit of the endeavor of the day. When you exhaust yourself out there trying to, you go to work, you come back, you eat, you go to zikr, you go to book distribution, you come back, you have this hour discussion after book distribution, you get back to Beit al-Aqwan 10, 11, sometime midnight, right? With the intention that when you go to bed, you get up and you pray that night vigil. This is part of Fikr Jamhuriyah. The sweetness of Laylatul Qadr, the sweetness of the night vigil. That's something that is a tremendous gift to Muslims, should they understand the importance of it, because it is a valuable practice, and it is it's a tremendous gift to that's introduced for Ustaz to be able to say that this is part of the Holy Prophet's Sunnah. Oh. And the Sunnah is the way out of our current dilemma. So I hope that gave you something, sister.
All right. Rawan, you have a question in the chat, but you are raising your hand. If you want to ask your question, please go ahead. You can turn on your mic and ask the question. to Dr. Abdullah. Rawan?
Yes. Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Ismail, and thank you so much, Dr. Ernest, for sharing your story. I think this has been very insightful for me, and I definitely feel very inspired and have learned a lot from you. So I'm very grateful. Um, I was wondering, what was your experience coming back to the U.S. after living in Sudan for the 9 years that you were there?
Mhm.
I'm just wondering, what were your feelings towards life in the U.S. and were there any aspects of your daily life with Ustaz that you were able to maintain after returning?
Okay, thank you for those questions. Those are deep questions. Um, Rawan, um, I've often said to people is that the culture shock of coming back to the States was more than going to Sudan. Sudan felt closer to my true self than the States ever has. So, but one of the things that started my problem coming back to the States is the posture of the United States with respect to Ustas's execution. So I carried that with me. I went to the embassy and things like that. I just thought, how you people stand for democracy or anything and you sit by and allow that to happen? That was my feeling about the States. And then I understood, it wasn't in their interest to be involved in this. It's not a moral decision, right? It's a global political decision. And it's about economics at the end of the day and positionality in the world. And so that's the States, when I came back, I was behind the curve in terms of computers, right? Um, but I didn't really miss the 70s and 80s, I have to say. I haven't heard anything yet or seen anything yet that made me feel like I missed something while I was in the Sudan. I don't think I missed anything. I'm so glad I was there for the 60s in San Francisco, for the late 60s and early 70s. But I didn't really feel as if the States had traveled that far, but I was really behind in the computer, the personal computer revolution. I had to catch up to that, and particularly as a teacher. But in terms of me being able to continue my practice, that's something that is quite different in the States. I mean, um, praying 5 times a day and fasting Ramadan was just something I did without even thinking about. And then getting up and trying to pray the night prayer at night was something that I longed to do when I was in the Sudan. Couldn't always do it, but yeah. But in the States, it was just a gradually erosion of my worship. And it was also, it impacted my health, my mental health, but also my physical health. I mean, I got diabetes when I came back to the States. I was hit with that because I was sedentary. I was in graduate school and I was sitting a lot at computers. I wasn't exercising and my body's just not designed for that. And so I ended up with diabetes. And I ended up kind of losing my focus, wandering a little bit, losing my focus, being a little bit uncertain. I focused on, degrees, education, getting a degree and that type of thing. But my own personal conduct was not as disciplined. It was not as focused and it didn't feel as rightly directed as it was when it was in the Sudan. The politics of the States are something that I always have been kind of interested in. And so I've taught African-American history and I teach multicultural studies. And so I'm able to engage at that level. And that's fulfilling to me at an intellectual level. But one of the things that I've encountered in the States that I think is been consistent is the feeling that Ustaz was right when he said that Fikr Jamhuriya can take place in the United States. It needs to. When I first heard that, I didn't think so. When I first met Ustaz Mahmoud, I had a very, very negative idea of the US. Part of it informed by studying a bit of Marxism, and the other part just being African American. And I was rejecting a lot about this country because it was being duplicitous and racist and sexist and all of the things that it can be. But Ustaz helped me to understand the US in a different way. And so by the time I returned, I had a much more positive attitude about the potential of the United States. And so when I got involved in my career, I was really motivated to pursue multicultural studies as a form of discipline, because I think that's a discipline that can lead people towards focusing on their own self-improvement and solving their problems and being less hurtful to other people. And so I would think that's one of the takeaways that I had from my time in Africa to here. I became less angry. I became more global in my thinking, and I look for the hand behind the hand now, when I didn't before. What I mean by that is, what is behind Trumpism, right? And what is the potential if this country comes to grips with Trumpism, which means it has to come to grips with democracy, which means it has to start to own the consequences of its actions, like adults should and nations should. So I feel this potential in the US after returning here that I wouldn't have had unless I went to Sudan for that period of time. So so I see behind even COVID, I see behind Trumpism the potential for an awakening. You see the Black Lives Matter movement, the Me Too movement, those are type of awakenings. I think people are ready for something. And that's exciting. It's exciting to see. And I see it in my students over time. I'm amazed and I'm encouraged by young people in this country who are much less, they have fewer hangups than their parents and the earlier generations. They're more accepting. They also are though they're very distracted, they are quite socially conscious. They have a very broad acceptance of different types of alternative ideologies and views and things, and so it's almost like a consciousness that's inclusive as opposed to exclusive. And that's hopeful, because that potentiality, I believe, is going to allow many people in this society to embrace a way out of our dilemma, because we're all in it. We're all in a mess. And there are great solutions out there, and Fikr Jamhuri is one of them. I hope that answered.
All right. Okay. Let us give the chance to Amna Zahari Balol. You can turn on your mic, Amna.
Yeah, so I wanted to take the time to thank you, Abdullah, for sharing your insightful story. It's always wonderful to hear your journey into becoming a Jamhuri. So when I always hear about the story of Ustaz, I try to kind of draw parallels between Ustaz and Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, James Baldwin. And one thing that I always think about is, the struggle of the African American in America. And of course, we all have our struggles in terms of being, children of the diaspora, but the African American struggle is distinct in its own way. And the history of America is built upon the labor of enslaved peoples. So my question is, has the Ustaz ever told you anything, or has he ever made any series of statements about the African-American struggle and what the history or the future of the African-American will be in America?
Thank you for that, Amna. Good to see you. Yes, I mean, Ustaz said things related to the African-American struggle. Like I mentioned the point earlier, his comment about Elijah Muhammad introducing only the word Islam. His real contribution is just the word, where he had a high opinion of Dr. King. He also helped me to re-evaluate Abraham Lincoln and even Richard Nixon. Ustaz is very interesting because Lincoln, I was willing to listen to him, and I said, when he started to talk about Nixon, I almost had like disbelief in my heart. I said, Nixon? In my mind, I didn't say that out loud. But in terms of the African-American struggle, Ustaz is on record as saying that America is going to be one of the places that Fikr Jamhuriya takes root. He's on record as saying that. What he helped me see when in talking about Abraham Lincoln was I was looking from really a Marxist critique of Lincoln, which points out all of the racist things he said. He said a few, but it ignores some of his other comments and some of his behavior that is not racist, right? And that was liberatory towards African Americans. And so in that conversation with him, he pointed me towards this idea that, and he said it actually, that every period of time has people who are essential for that time. And he said Abraham Lincoln was essential for that time to move America forward to where it has arrived at. And I started to think about that, you know, to look at Lincoln from that perspective. And I started to reread some of the biographies on him and so forth. And it's obvious he really was a very unusual human being. And he was very devout. And he made courageous decisions, and his decisions proved over time to be the right decisions, almost in all cases. Then you had like Nixon, you know, Stas had, and Roosevelt. He talked about both of those people to me, to FDR. And he said that FDR represented this uniqueness in America, that you could have a physically disabled president, right? And, you know, I tried to say, well, people didn't know that he was physically disabled and so forth, which is kind of true, but a lot of people did, especially people in the government. And they followed him, and he was elected 3 times. I mean, we have two-term limits now because of FDR. If he would have lived, they would have elected him again. He was that popular. So what he pointed out to me was that FDR was important to stop Nazism. His coalition with Stalin, his ability to work with Churchill and so forth. He was the right man at the right time. Let's just say right person, not right man. He was the right person at that time. And his presence at that time allowed the world to continue in a trajectory that's going to allow Islam to take root. This is what he was saying to me without, I don't know how explicitly he said it, but it was clear that that's what he was saying. He then talked about Nixon. And what he said was that Nixon détente, his treaties with China, kept the USSR isolated and slowed their progress in the developing world. I said, wow, look at his global thinking, right? And he said, without that, reaching out to China in that way, the USSR would have gained much more power and influence than it already had. And he said, it's the real danger to Deen. That's how he pointed it out. He said that communism, Marxism, is the real danger to Deen, because it is a very coherent, largely rational ideology, right? But it's purely materialistic, has no room for religion. And so those are some of the kind of discussions that we had. And I took away from the discussion like a little humility, like I didn't know anything. I never thought on those huge levels. But Ustaz Mahmoud is thinking on a global geopolitical level and looking at the trajectory of La ilaha illallah over time. That's what he's articulating, right? And so he's saying, and so even after the fall of the Berlin Wall, I started to say, well, that's pretty much the end of the USSR, right? Everybody's thinking they're over. America's now the superpower. And I used to kind of think, well, how should I understand this? Because Ustaz Mahmoud said that the USSR is the greatest threat to Deen, and that the United States, because it doesn't have a coherent ideology, has trouble standing up to it, right? And and there's no nuclear solution to the problem, because that will annihilate everybody. So that's the dilemma. But I was saying, okay, well, maybe Ustaz didn't see this coming. Wait a few years and then you have Russia, and you have Russia's impact on the world right now. It's the same country with a different name. It's the same system. And it is a destructive force in the world. It literally targets democracies and tries to destroy them from within. It's responsible, I believe, for a lot of this chaos that we just saw on the 6th of January. The Soviet Union devotes its resources to social media, psychologically targeting populations in order to turn them on one another. Look what it does with its resources. Because it has nothing to offer. But it is a destructive force. And so Ustaz was really right. That force has to be dealt with. Yeah, China has to be dealt with. So in terms of African Americans specifically, Ustaz talked about Dr. King. He talked about nonviolence, and he talked about the potential of African Americans. One of the things I took from one of the brothers who I believe took this from his understanding of what Ustaz said was that Allah didn't place 5 million, which is now 13 million people of African descent in America for no reason. And that suffering, Ustaz did talk about this. He was talking about African-American athletes. One time he asked me, what do you think is the reason that African-Americans excel in athletics? And so I talked about, lack of opportunity to excel in other places, for one. But then I thought there's something to the point that that slavery was so cruel and harsh that only the strong did survive it. And so there was a purging of that West African population, predominantly West African population that came here, and only the strong genes made it, right? And I said to him, I believe that has something to do with our prowess. And he didn't articulate the idea. He didn't validate it or not validate it, but I walked away thinking there might be something to that. And so I'm tying that to the fact that if you look at American history, like you said, African Americans are right at the heart of it. The Black Lives Matter movement, even now, the multicultural movement is now focusing on Black lives, focusing on Black labor, the compensation of Black labor and that type of thing. It's forefronting it. And I think that's for a reason, because if you look at the history of the US, the original sin was slavery. The piece that America has to face and benefit from facing is its history of enslaving other human beings, calling itself a Christian society, calling itself a democracy, and then treating people of color, but in particular African Americans, the way that it did it. That has to be owned up with. When that original sin is atoned for, then this country is going to accelerate. It will accelerate because, you know, you have a police force now running around with impunity, killing Black people. You know, that's horrible for Black people. It's horrible for all people, and people are starting to realize that. You don't want your officers of the law to be engaged in murder of people. What type of society does that make you? Murder's murder. You can call it what you like. You don't have to prosecute the person for people to look at what happened to George Floyd and understand that that was murder. So America has to come to grips with itself, or it's going to implode. That's its only other choice. And we saw that on January 6th. There's enough angry, frightened people out there that could really create something. So I think you're right in your sentiment about African Americans, and I think African Americans have a role to play, and Islam is attractive to African Americans for a lot of reasons. And part of it is, I think, that the other religions and ideologies that we have addressed over time have surpassed their usefulness. That's my feeling, right? There was a time when Christianity was absolutely essential for the survival of African American people. There was a time. But I believe now Christianity is not providing what is needed at this moment. And that's going to cause people to search. And Islam, properly articulated, will provide an alternative that many people will be attracted to, hopefully sooner than later. I hope that made some sense.
All right. Okay, thank you, Amna. All right, let us give the chance to Selma Abdullah. Go ahead, Selma. Turn on your mic.
Assalamu alaikum. I was enjoying this very much, and I have two main questions that I ask most of the times. The first one is, what do you think the origin of having multiple divisions within the Republican community, although they have the same basic ideology? And do you think this is for good reason, or it's a problem that we should deal with as Republicans? And the second one is, do you think that there is a chance of going back to the time, the form of life that you were living with the Ustaz, or it's the era of an individual-based rather than community-based work?
So, no, I didn't get the last part, Salma. Say again.
I was asking,
living with Ustaz.
Yes, if there is a chance of living in the form in that form of life that you were having with the Ustaz Mahmoud, or there is no any chance of going back to that time, and it's just the era of an individual-based rather than community-based work. I mean, Republican community.
Okay, I think I see what you're
saying.
Thank you. All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Well, when you say Republicans, first I thought you were talking about those Republicans out there. Thank God you're not. Yeah, Jamhuriyin, because I don't want this to sound trite, Salman. I hope it doesn't throw you off, but yeah, they say in Christianity, the Lord works in mysterious ways. And so Ustaz Mahmoud's presence in terms of Fikr Jamhuriya was paramount for the time that he was with us, because his worship gave him not only the insight, but the authority to say what he was saying. Because what he's saying is, what you think is deen is not deen. That's a huge statement to Muslims and to monotheists. So I think it's only natural that within this free thinking community that Ustaz helped to cultivate, you're going to have a variety of opinions. Even with Ustaz Mahmoud present, you had a variety of opinions. And Ustaz Mahmoud would said, as long as you're being honest, there's value in what you think and what you say. You see, as long as you're being honest, what you think and what you say has value. So many times in our open discussions after Hamla, people would say things and Ustaz wouldn't correct them, because there's value in what people say, even if it's not the necessarily correct understanding. Maybe a senior brother would step in and give a better interpretation or contradict what the person said. Sometimes Ustaz would say to the senior brothers, it's better sometimes not to speak so soon. Allow people the opportunity to articulate their ideas, because that's part of dignifying human beings, to be free to speak your mind. So the different beliefs, the different understandings, the different practices amongst brothers and sisters, I see it as a natural consequence of who we are, and a natural consequence of the way in which we were trained to approach Fikr Jamhuriya. Ustaz, there was never just one idea. Every human being had his own understanding. I talked to very senior brothers about things and they disagreed with me. And that was okay. I mean, sometimes it shocked me, but it was the nature of our growth process as well, is that you had the right to disagree. You had the right to think what you wanted and to say what you think, right? As long as it's not hurting other people. So that's on that piece. And then, do I think that was just an individual phase or with Ustaz Mahmoud, and not, you know, and where's the community, you know, the Islamic community? So we individually were moving towards this Islamic community, but in fact, the Islamic community has not been created. Is it going to possibly appear now, or are we going to continue on our individual trajectory? Allahu Alam. I don't know. I don't know what, you know, but this is what I think. I think that Ustaz's understanding of La ilaha illallah is correct. And that that deen, religion, monotheism, is being perfected, has been perfected over time, and that human beings are also perfecting their capacity over time. And my thought is that at some point it's going to meet. I don't know when, but I think at some point it's going to meet, is that human beings will have the intelligence to realize that they have a clear path out of their dilemma that will solve their problems. It will create a peaceful individuals. It can construct a peaceful community and world, and right? And at the same time, provide people with the freedom to worship or not worship. As long as they don't break laws, they're going to be fine. You know what I mean? So the dilemma of not having a unified community at present, I think, is a consequence of the nature of the ideology that we embrace and the world in which we live. But if Allah created us for a purpose, right? There's a purpose for us being here, Bini Adam, on this earth. And if we continue to evolve intelligently, we'll realize that purpose. But we have to evolve intelligently. Tariq Muhammad will accelerate that evolution. So I do believe that the community is in the future of the world. In fact, my true belief is, if we do not achieve a community, a global community in which all human beings' dignity is respected and their basic human needs are provided for, if we don't achieve that community, our days as a species are numbered, because our intelligence has allowed us to be very destructive. And we can also, as America just proved with that former occupant of the White House, we can have very unstable people, mean, dishonest, immoral, hateful, ignorant people with the nuclear codes, with access to the nuclear codes. That man could have started a nuclear war. So that's a frightening reality that this world lives in right now, is that if that could happen in the US, it's likely to be able to happen other places. And so the need for a peaceful, good society has never been greater. And one of the things that anthropologists tell us is that human beings arrived at this point through solving their problems. So I do believe in the capacity of us to solve our problems. And one of the things that has been instrumental in solving our problems is divine revelation, should we be open to it. This is true of, let's say, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. We've got tremendous grace and help from our Creator in that way. And even though there's been a lot of destruction in the name of religion, there has been more construction and positives contributed by religion, though it has its history of war and carnage. What it has offered to people over time has been invaluable to getting us to the point we're at right now. But it's like Ustaz is saying, it's insufficient now to solve our problems as understood. And so human beings we have to evolve.
Okay.
I hope that answered.
Yeah, we have only 2 minutes, but there is a question here, and there is a code, but also from Amna Balol, but I'm going to ask the question first so that give Amin Abu Bakr Bashir says to you, Salam, ya Ustaz Abdullah, ya Ustaz Abdullah Ernest. You have used the word dilemma a few times now. I am curious, could you tell us about your view on the dilemma facing the United States, or maybe list or a few of its characteristics?
Mhm.
Before you answer the question, let me read Amna's quotation.
Okay. All right.
She said, thank you all. There is a quote by James Baldwin that I think is very relevant to the US today. The quote, history is not the past, it is the present. We carry our history with us. We are our history.
Yeah, we are. And the dilemma is that human beings were created with the illusion of free will. It's an illusion because ultimately Allah's will has prevailed and will prevail. But we have the illusion of free will. And it's a powerful thing. It's what allows us the advantage over the rest of creation. With it, we were allowed to accelerate our cognitive growth, our spiritual growth, our physical growth. And we're in this position now where we've evolved to the point that people have even concluded that there's no need for God anymore. God was needed at an earlier developmental stage. We no longer need him. Human beings can solve their own problems now. This is the ultra materialistic kind of interpretation. But it's consistent with what you see both in the communist world and in the capitalist world. The nations are ultimately placing the state and the party, which is a bunch of elites pretending to not be, in the communist world, or the market and those elites who benefit from it ahead of the rest of humanity. The growth of the market is more important than the dignity of human beings. That's the dilemma. Human beings are created in the image of their creator. We are dignified by definition and deserve to be treated as such. So the dilemma is, how are we as a diverse groups of human beings across the globe who are becoming increasingly powerful, right, going to coexist on the same planet without a unifying ideology and a methodology that can allow us to become more peaceful creatures? That's the dilemma. And it's a matter of time. We have to embrace that process that can bring about individual peace and world peace in order to survive. If not, we'll be replaced and a more intelligent species can replace us. That's really, because when I look at, I might be wrong, but when I look at anthropology and you look at paleoanthropology, Homo habilis and Homo erectus and Neanderthal, all of them came to a dead end. And there's no reason to assume that we won't if we do not evolve. So I think that that is a true dilemma, and it's a life and death situation. James Baldwin is right that the solution to the problem is in the present. The history that we make today and tomorrow will determine the future of this world. And the beauty of it is every individual has the ability to contribute to the positive. And I think that that might be the ultimate solution, is that each individual bring their own light. And then you have this 1,000 million points of light, creating a critical mass of enlightenment. That is possible. And there's available an enlightened ideology to unify. that effort. But it's not going to happen until we're ready. You know, if we're still running around like, you know, the great apes, right? Bludgeoning one another over the head, you know, mistreating women, mistreating children, denying the dignity of everybody weaker than ourselves. What's the point of us sustaining our existence if we can't do better? So that's my response to that. I hope you felt that was honest, because that's what I really feel.
Really, it is amazing, informative, and interesting discussion. I think everybody, we reached like 60 participants here, and everybody definitely came out with good stuff from this good discussion and good presentation from Dr. Abdullah Ernest. Abdullah, the floor is yours to say last words before we.
No, I know that our time is short. I just want to thank everybody who attended. Thank you, Ismail, Ashari, Abdul Hajj, and anybody else who was Khalid Al Hassan. I don't know who else, Omar, anybody that was involved in helping making this happen. It was a pleasure for me to do. I hope we can do it again in the future. Well, ma salama, kullu sana antum tayyibin, wa fursa saida. Shukran.
شكرا جزيلا. السلام عليكم.
وعليكم السلام.